I want to talk about 3 to 5 of your favorite contradictions. They're all subjective. This is your decision, and we'll just start with one and work from there. I'd like to pick 3 to 5 major contradictions in the New Testament that you really enjoy.
Okay, I'll tell you. First one I'll tell you is the one that made me realize that that the Bible's not inerrant. If people have read my stuff, they might have heard this one. But in Mark chapter 2, so let me just say, I was a fundamentalist. I thought there was no mistakes in the Bible of any kind, no contradictions. I could explain anything. And so, like fundamentalists today still can. And so, in Mark chapter 2, Jesus' disciples are going through the fields of grain. It's a Sabbath. They're hungry. They peel off some grain. They start eating it. And the Pharisees see them doing it. I guess Pharisees are in every corner in Galilee watching to see if people are eating grain on the Sabbath. They're doing it, and the Pharisees get really upset. And they say, Jesus, your disciples are harvesting grain on the Sabbath. You can't do that. And tell them to stop. And Jesus says, look, don't you remember what King David did when Abiathar was the high priest? He went into the temple and ate the showbread with his people, with his men, because they were hungry, even though only the priests are supposed to eat it. Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. And so you have this story. So I had this class at Princeton Seminary, a Greek interpretation of Mark. My first semester is like we studied Mark in Greek, and at the end we had to write a term paper. I wrote a term paper on this passage because this passage says that this took place in the Old Testament when Abiathar was the high priest. But the Old Testament says that it took place when Ahimelech was the high priest, Abiathar's father. So I wrote a 30-page paper arguing that, in fact, even though it says that Abiathar was the high priest, it means that Ahimelech was the high priest. It's a very complicated argument, and with the grammar of the Greek and the style, I already saw 30 pages later, boom, it really was Ahimelech, and Jesus knew it. So at the end, my teacher was very pious and very devout Christian, but he wasn't a fundamentalist, but he was a very devout Christian. And he liked my paper, gave me an A on the paper, but then at the bottom he said, maybe Mark just made a mistake. And I thought, that would be easier than a 30-page paper that's dancing around the problem. Yeah, okay. So once I realized that, it opened the floodgate. After that, I started finding all sorts of contradictions. And the thing is that sometimes they're big and sometimes they're little. But if somebody's a fundamentalist, the big ones don't bother you because you can explain those away. Those are easy. It's the little ones that you think, oh, God, how do you do that? For example, here's another favorite one of mine. In the Gospel of Mark, I think it's chapter 5. There's a man who's a leader of a synagogue, whose daughter has gotten sick, and he comes up to Jesus and he says to Jesus, "My daughter's sick, and could you come heal her because she's going to die?" And Jesus says, "Okay." So Jesus starts going to his house, and before he can get there, he gets interrupted. Another thing happens. Somebody bothers, and he has to deal with this other thing. And by this time, the man's daughter's died. So he gets there, and it's too late. She's dead. I'm too late. Jesus says, "Don't worry about it. I'll heal her." And so he goes into the room. She's dead. She's up, and he raises her from the dead. That's Mark's gospel. Matthew's gospel says that what happened is, this guy's name was Jairus, by the way. His name was Jairus. So this is the story of Jairus' daughter, Jairus. And so in Matthew, it says, this man Jairus comes up to Jesus and he says, my daughter has just died. Can you do anything about it? In Mark's gospel, she wasn't dead yet. The whole point is she wasn't dead yet. But right. In Matthew, she comes up, my daughter died. Can you do? So Jesus goes and he raises her from the dead. Okay, but it's like, which was it? It couldn't be both. So when I was a graduate student, I started to leave my view of the inerrancy of the Bible, that it was infallible. And we had a visiting scholar from Scandinavia, who was a very famous scholar, who thought, he had these ideas about things, and who thought that there weren't mistakes in the New Testament. So I said, okay, so you got with the story of Jairus, like she's sick and then she dies, and the other one, she's dead ahead of time. So I said, which is it? And he said to me, it happened twice. First time it happened, the girl was sick and then she died. And later, like in a later episode, she had died again, and she was, oh my God, are you serious?
Oh man.
And so I'll give you the third instance. I'll give you is one that I just recently I thought was really, really quite good. A year and a half ago, right before COVID hit, in February of 2020, I was in Chicago at a Christian apologists conference. So, as you know, Christian apologists are defenders of the faith. They're conservative evangelicals or fundamentalists who think that, you know, they can defend everything in the faith, that it's all logical, makes sense, and they can argue for it. This conference was on whether the Bible's contradictions in it or not, whether the Gospels have contradictions. They had 3 speakers there who were all very conservative evangelical apologists. And they had me because they wanted to hear another side of the story. And, you know, they wanted to see what they were up against. And so I went. I wasn't sure what was going to happen. This may not be good, but it was great. I had a great time. They were really nice. They were pleasant. We had jokes. We laughed. And there were a group of students there from Moody Bible Institute, where I had gone out of high school. So I was a graduate when I was a fundamentalist. And so I said, oh my God, let's have lunch together. They said, yeah, great. So we had lunch and it was great. We told stories. It was a great time. But so we're having this thing, and I lay out the argument why there are contradictions, and these other guys are saying, yeah, no, they aren't contradictions. And Mike Licona was one of the presenters there, who's one of the leading apologists today. He's a serious guy, and he has a PhD in New Testament studies, and so he's written books defending the Christian faith, including why you have these seem to have discrepancies in the Gospels. His view is that you do have these differences in the Gospels, but it's because the Gospel writers are following standard protocols for how you write biographies in the ancient world. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they wrote biographies. So, you know, they're just following the biographers do things. And so in places it looks like you have discrepancies. So we give our talks, and Mike does his thing, I do my thing. And afterwards, the moderator gets up, who's also a conservative evangelical, and he says, okay, so the 4 of you, I've got a question. I want you all to answer this. In Mark's gospel, Jesus sends out the disciples on his mission during his ministry to go out and heal the sick and cast out demons. And he says to them, don't take a backpack, don't take extra sandals, don't take any money, don't take a staff, just go. And so there you go. In Matthew's gospel, same episode, Jesus sends them out, go heal the sick, raise the dead, or cast out demons, and don't take a backpack, don't take extra sandals, don't take any extra money, and take a staff. Just the opposite of what Mark says.
Mm-hmm.
So the moderator says, okay, which did Jesus say? And I said, well, he probably said neither, because I don't think it's historical. I said, but I said, Mark's the earlier one. So when Mark says, don't take a staff, Matt says he did take a staff. It's a contradiction. And he asked the other two. The other two kind of reconcile. They hemmed and hawed and come figure out some way. Oh, maybe it happened twice, so they kind of thing. Yeah. Got to Licona. Mike Licona says, well, Mark is right. He said what Mark says, don't take a staff. Okay. And then the moderator says, okay, to everybody, do you think Matthew's account is inerrant? I said, no. The other two said yes. And Licona says, yes, it's inerrant. I said, Mike, you just said that Matthew contradicts Mark. It's the opposite of what Mark says. Mark says, don't take a staff. Matthew says, take a staff. And that's the opposite. So, but now you're saying it's not an error. And I said, what would it be an error if a contradiction's not an error? He said, well, but Matthew meant to change it because he's following the protocols of writing biographers. So he knew what he was doing, so he changed it. He said, look, Mike, it doesn't matter if he meant to do it. Some people mean to lie. But just because they mean to lie doesn't mean it's not a lie. If you mean to make a contradiction, it's still a contradiction.
Yeah, how would that work if you walked in the door and your wife at 3 a.m. goes, "Where were you?" I was not at the strip club.
Yeah,
Or, you know, like
oh, no, I was in bed with you.
I was in bed.
What? No, but it's not a contradiction because I know it wasn't right.
Oh,
So those are three of my favorites.
those are the three. Hey, that's legendary. Dr. Bart Ehrman, thank you so much. This has been fun. I hope you enjoyed those three contradictions.